The Mitchell family had moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, hoping to leave behind the noise and chaos of the city. The house, though dated and slightly run down, had a charm that the family couldn't resist. The sprawling garden, the high ceilings, and the vintage wooden floors were the perfect setting for a family who longed for peace. But they didn't know that the house harbored an unsettling secret beneath its surface, a secret hidden deep within the basement. It had all started the first night they spent in the house. After a long day of unpacking and settling in, the family gathered in the living room, exhausted but content. That night, as the parents, Sarah and Tom, tucked their children, Emily and Jake, into bed, they heard the sound of something faintly whispering from below. At first, they thought it was the wind whistling through the cracks of the old house, but the whispering didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow louder as the night wore on. Sarah, a woman who never believed in anything supernatural, dismissed it as the house settling. Tom, on the other hand, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that gnawed at him. The house had been empty for years, and no one had lived here for a long time. So why would there be whispers in the dark? The next day, as the family settled into their new home, they began hearing more than just whispers. At first, it was faint, like a distant murmur, but as the days went by, it became harder to ignore. The voice was softer at first, like a distant memory, like someone calling their names. Sarah, Tom, Emily. It would whisper, almost tenderly. One evening, Sarah was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when she heard the whisper once more. Only this time, it wasn't the soft voice calling her name. It was a clearer, more urgent voice, a voice she recognized. "Sarah, come down here. Come and see what we have done." Chilled to the bone, Sarah dropped the knife. Her heart began to race as she turned to look at the basement door. The house was silent, except for the pounding of her heartbeat in her ears. She tried to shake it off, but the voice had a tone of familiarity. It sounded like her own voice. In a daze, Sarah found herself drawn to the basement door. She had never paid much attention to it before, always assuming it was locked and forgotten. But as she turned the handle, it creaked open on its own, as if beckoning her in. She hesitated, but her feet moved forward, almost of their own accord. She took the stairs slowly, the air growing colder with every step. The basement was dark, too dark. She reached for the light switch, but as her hand brushed it, the whispering voice returned, this time with a stronger, more commanding tone. "Don't touch it." The lights flickered and then died. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as if something had turned on a switch, the room filled with a low, static hum, like a broken radio picking up fragments of voices. Sarah's pulse raced as she stumbled backward, her eyes desperately trying to adjust to the pitch-black darkness. Her thoughts were swirling, and she could feel the walls closing in. Was she losing her mind? A flash of movement caught her eye. Someone was standing in the far corner of the room, hidden in the shadows. As she squinted, the figure moved closer. She could make out the outline of a face, but it wasn't a face she recognized. It was her own face. Before she could scream, the whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. The voice was louder, clearer, repeating everything she had ever said, every secret she had kept hidden, every regret she had buried. Tom heard his wife's terrified scream from upstairs and rushed to the basement door, finding it locked. He pounded on it, his voice frantic. "Sarah, open the door! What's going on down there?" But Sarah was frozen. The figure in the corner wasn't just standing anymore, it was moving toward her. The voice, it was her own voice, but distorted like a warped recording, recounting her darkest memories. It echoed through the room, twisting her every word, every thought. "Sarah, Sarah, you deserve to hear the truth." Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure, the mirror image of herself, stepped closer, its lips curling into a twisted smile. With each step, the whispers grew louder, repeating everything she had ever done wrong, everything she wished she could forget. Tom, unable to break down the door, scrambled for a tool. He was desperate. What was happening to his wife? Why wouldn't she answer? Emily and Jake, wide-eyed, stood at the top of the stairs, listening. The whispers were no longer just confined to the basement. They could hear them from the walls, from the very air in the house. It was like the house was alive, breathing, watching them. "Mom?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Upstairs, Sarah began to lose control. The room had become a twisted version of her life, every dark moment replaying before her eyes. Her own voice echoed through the space, recounting her pain, her guilt, her fear. She couldn't escape. The basement was alive, alive with her past. In a final act of desperation, Sarah lunged at the light switch again, and this time, the lights came on. flooding the basement with a harsh, blinding glow. But the figure of herself was gone. The voice stopped. For a moment there was peace, but then the whispers started again. This time, they weren't coming from the basement. They were coming from within the walls, echoing throughout the house. "We know everything," the voices whispered, "and we'll never let you leave." Tom, finally breaking the door open, rushed in to find Sarah standing in the middle of the room, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. She had no words. No explanations, just the hollow stare of someone who had seen things no one should ever witness. As the whispers continued to grow louder, Sarah's gaze locked onto the walls of the basement. It was no longer just a house. It was a prison for their secrets, for their past. The house would never let them go. The Mitchell family wasn't the first to live in the house, and they wouldn't be the last.
When Mike Caldwell inherited the old family house from his late uncle, he had no idea what he was walking into. The house was located on the outskirts of town, far from the bustling city life he had grown accustomed to. But after years of barely keeping in touch with his uncle, Mike figured he should make the trip and honor his late relative's final wish. The house was old, but sturdy enough. The sense of neglect that hung in the air made Mike uncomfortable the moment he walked in. The first few days were uneventful. Mike spent his time cleaning, going through old boxes in the attic, and trying to make the house livable again. The house had an old-fashioned charm, with creaky wooden floors and vintage furniture. But there was one thing about the house that made Mike uneasy: the basement. His uncle had always kept it locked, and Mike remembered that as a child, his uncle would often warn him not to go down there. Now that the house was his, Mike found the warning more unsettling than before. There was something about the basement, something he couldn't put his finger on. It was as if the house was trying to keep him away from it.
One evening, as Mike was exploring the basement door, the air felt heavy around him. He stood in front of it for a long time, his hand hovering over the old rusted lock. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to make the decision. He knew it was wrong to open it, but his curiosity got the better of him. He had to know what was down there. With a deep breath, Mike found an old set of keys and unlocked the door. It creaked open slowly, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent house. The basement was cold and dark, and the stairs leading down were steep and narrow. As Mike descended, he could hear the faint sound of what seemed like breathing. His pulse quickened, and he hesitated, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The air in the basement was thick, stagnant, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. He turned on the light, scanning the room. There was nothing unusual at first glance. Old boxes, discarded furniture, and dust-covered shelves filled the space. But then something caught his eye, an old wooden chest in the far corner, almost hidden behind a stack of crates. It was odd, out of place. Why hadn't his uncle mentioned it? With a mix of excitement and fear, Mike approached the chest. His fingers trembled as he brushed the dust off its surface. He tugged at the rusty latch, and with a loud creak, the chest opened. Inside, there was nothing but old clothes, yellowed papers, and a strange, thick book. It was bound in faded leather, its pages filled with handwritten notes. As he flipped through it, the words seemed to crawl off the page. They weren't just words, they were commands, warnings, pleas. Mike felt the air grow colder, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to stretch and shift. It wasn't just a noise, it was something far worse. It was a warning. Mike froze, his breath caught in his throat. But it was too late. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the black abyss behind it. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. In the darkness, something moved. A figure, tall and gaunt, its body long and twisted, emerged from the darkness. Its face was contorted and monstrous, hollow eyes staring back at Mike with an insatiable hunger. It was like no creature he had ever seen, half human, half something else. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its teeth yellowed and sharp, and the worst part, it was smiling. Mike stumbled back in terror, his body frozen in place. The creature's grin widened as it stepped closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally. The air around it seemed to shimmer with dark energy, as though it didn't belong in this world. The creature let out a low, raspy laugh. "You should have stayed away," it hissed. "Now you're mine." Mike's heart pounded in his chest as the creature took another step forward. He scrambled backward, his eyes darting around the basement, searching for an escape. The only way out was up the stairs, but the creature was fast, too fast. It lunged, its claws extending like daggers, and Mike barely managed to dodge its attack, falling to the ground with a crash. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins. The creature's laughter echoed in his ears, growing louder with each passing second. He could feel the weight of its presence, like it was closing in on him from all sides. He had to get out. In a panic, Mike sprinted up the basement stairs, hearing the creature's footsteps behind him. As he reached the top, he slammed the basement door shut, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. The creature slammed against the door with a terrifying force, and Mike heard it growl in frustration, but the door held. For now, Mike was panting, his mind racing. What had he just encountered? What had been hiding in that basement all this time? He glanced around the house, the walls feeling like they were closing in around him. But he didn't have much time. The creature would be back. It had tasted his fear, and now it wouldn't stop until it had him. His uncle had known. The book had been a warning, a desperate attempt to keep the creature locked away. But Mike had broken the seal, and now he would pay the price. For the rest of the night, Mike couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house, every creak of the floorboard, every gust of wind sounded like the creature was closing in. He couldn't escape. The house, the creature, it was all part of the same nightmare. He was trapped just like the others before him. And then, in the dead of night, as Mike sat in the living room, staring into the dark hallway, he heard it. The growl. The unmistakable sound of something waiting in the shadows. He wasn't alone anymore. The creature was still in the house. The basement dweller had finally awoken, and Mike Caldwell's life would never be the same again. The forgotten room. The old house on the outskirts of town had always been a bit of an enigma. For years it had sat abandoned, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling away, almost as if it were deliberately trying to hide from the world. Despite its eerie appearance, when the Rivers family, Jack, Claire, and their 2 children, found the property for sale, they were drawn to it. The price was right, and after years of living in cramped apartments, the promise of space and quiet was too tempting to resist. When they first moved in, the house seemed to have all the charm of an old Victorian home. High ceilings, creaking floors, and a winding staircase that added an air of elegance. The atmosphere was dusty, but peaceful. There was something about the house that felt ancient. Claire felt it when she stepped through the door for the first time. A peculiar sensation, like the house was watching her. But as time went on, she shook off the feeling. They were just old houses, she reasoned. It was normal for them to have character. It wasn't until their first weekend there that things started to take a darker turn. Jack had been busy clearing out the garage, while Claire began sorting through the many boxes of items they had yet to unpack. The kids, Emma and Luke, were exploring the house, eager to pick their bedrooms. It was a typical Saturday morning, nothing out of the ordinary. But as Claire went to the basement to find a few more boxes, she noticed something strange. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind old wooden beams and dust-covered crates, was a trapdoor. It was small, square, and had no handle or visible latch. It looked old, like it hadn't been opened in years. Claire stood frozen for a moment. Her curiosity piqued. But what made her step forward wasn't just the trapdoor itself. It was the feeling that it had always been there, waiting for someone to notice it. Her hand hovered over the latch, an unsettling feeling growing in her chest. For some reason, she knew she shouldn't open it. Yet at the same time, something compelled her to do so. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but it lingered, like a whisper from the shadows. As if drawn by an invisible force, Claire bent down and pried the door open. It creaked, loud and sharp, echoing through the silence of the basement. Below was a narrow staircase leading into complete darkness. The air that hit her was thick and stale, like the very space had been shut away from the world for too long. Claire hesitated again, but could feel her heart racing, urging her to explore. She grabbed the flashlight from the nearby shelf and began to descend, every step creaking under her weight. As she reached the bottom, she found herself in a small, cramped room. The walls were lined with dark, aged wallpaper, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and old crates. The air was suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Claire's flashlight flickered, and just as it stabilized, she saw something that made her blood cold, a large wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. It was out of place, and as Claire approached, her skin crawled with a sense of dread. It wasn't just the eerie silence that unnerved her. It was the way the cabinet seemed to loom, as if it were waiting for her to open it. Despite every instinct telling her to turn back, Claire reached for the cabinet's handle. Her hand shook as she pulled it open. Inside, she found nothing, at first. But as her flashlight moved deeper, she spotted something wedged in the back of the cabinet. A stack of old, yellowed papers. As she pulled them out, they fluttered in her hands, and her breath caught. They were journals, handwritten with messy, hurried notes. Claire flipped through them, her eyes scanning over the words that seemed to jump off the page. They watch me from the shadows. They know everything. They want me to be like them. The door is open, but I can't go back. I hear them whispering. They are coming. The words grew more erratic, the handwriting shakier, as though the writer had grown desperate. Claire could feel her heart pounding as she turned the last page, and there, at the very end, was a single, horrifying line. I am the last to leave. They have taken the others. A chill ran through Claire's spine. She couldn't explain it, but something about the room felt alive, like it had been waiting for her. She closed the journal quickly and stood up, her mind racing. But as she turned to leave, a sound, soft but distinct, echoed from the corner of the room. It sounded like someone or something breathing. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She froze, trying to steady her breath. There in the corner of the room, the air seemed to shimmer. A figure, a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light, stood motionless. It wasn't human, though. It was too tall, too still. Claire's blood ran cold as the figure shifted slightly, and she realized it wasn't alone. In the darkness behind it, more shapes began to emerge, all of them hauntingly similar, tall, shadowy, and faceless. She backed away slowly, her mind screaming for her to run, but her body refused to move. With a jolt of terror, she spun and bolted up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind her. She didn't stop running until she was back upstairs, breathing heavily, her hands shaking. Jack was in the living room, looking up in surprise as she burst through the door. Claire? What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. She could barely form the words to explain what she'd seen. It was all too real, too terrifying. But when she finally managed to speak, she said, "There's something down there. Something wrong." Jack dismissed it, chalking it up to her imagination. But Claire wasn't convinced. That night, as they prepared for bed, she could still feel the weight of the basement's presence pressing on her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just an old house, nothing more. But as she lay in bed, the sound of soft whispers began to float up the stairs, filling the room with a sense of dread. The whispers were clearer now, and they were calling her name. Claire, come back. The voices from the basement were calling her, beckoning her down into the dark. The next morning, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the house was changing her, making her a part of something dark and ancient. Jack still didn't believe her. But every time she looked at the basement door, she felt its pull, like it was alive, waiting for her to return. And worse, the whispers never stopped. They were always there, lingering just beneath the surface. And the more she ignored them, the louder they grew. Claire had no idea that the house had already claimed others before her, each one lured by the same forgotten room. And now the house had chosen her. The trapdoor had been waiting for someone to open it. It always would be. The forgotten room was just the beginning. Now, Claire's fate was sealed, and with every passing day, the house grew closer to claiming another soul.